Hello students and welcome to this IB Business Management exam tips video. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to write conclusions to an AO3 essay. So hopefully you've watched the first video where I talk about how to write AO3 essays. In that video, I went through the rubric and I kind of gave a background to how you write AO3 essays. I'm not going to go through all of that again. What I'm going to do is take the rubric and focus on the bits to relate to the conclusion. I've actually highlighted those in red. So it's the last bullet point that we need to look at. Arguments are substantiated and balanced with an explanation of the limitations of the case study or stimulus material. So in the conclusion, there's three things I think we need to do. Number one, we need to have a conclusion. Number two, we need to justify our conclusion. And then number three, we need to talk about the limitations of the case study. And I'm going to talk about those three in detail during this video. A quick reminder of the structure of the AO3. There are many different ways we can structure AO3 essays. This is the way I recommend doing it, but there are other ways we can do it. So firstly, write an introduction. And then the main body, it depends on the question. So this is the pros and cons one. So for example, should company X go public? So you want to do 3 pros, 3 cons. And then throughout this process, you're peeling, you're using the tools, terms and theories, and you're referring to the case study. Again, if you're not sure about any of this, go back to the AO3 video, the one before this on the playlist. And then in this video, we're going to talk about the conclusion here that's coming up. So in conclusion, before we actually get it, this is how I'm going to recommend doing it. We're going to state the conclusion, 3 sentences justifying why, and then limitations of the information provided. And I'm going to go through each of these on one slide. Just a quick note about the limitations of the information provided. You don't actually have to do that in the conclusion. You can do that throughout the essay, but I think it works well in the conclusion. So the first thing you want to do is state your conclusion explicitly. And by that, I mean, write something like this. So in conclusion, and I would start your conclusion with the words in conclusion or to sum up or something like that. And I think the reason we do that is that when we're showing the reader that we're actually getting to the conclusion so we know what to expect. And then just answer the question. Company X should choose option 1 or whatever it is. So the example I'm going to use in this video is this question here that I brought up in the first video. So using the data provided in table 3, wherever it is, other information in the stimulus and the BCG matrix, recommend whether the business should introduce a new product into the portfolio. So obviously when you're doing the question, there'll be a case study there, but I'm just going to use this question without the case study just to show you what sort of things it might look like. So here we're just going to answer the question. In conclusion, the business should not introduce a new product. Obviously, if you think they should, then you're going to say they should. And that's all we need to do here. On to the second part, which is you're going to say 3 sentences justifying why you chose the conclusion. Now, again, here, maybe you write 2 sentences, maybe you write 4, but 3 is a good rule of thumb for how much you need to write here. Now, this bit's, I think, quite tricky. How do we justify our conclusion? Because I think in our heads, we have a reason why we've chosen one of those conclusions. But here I'm going to make some suggestions about a framework we can use for justifying our conclusion. Something I read a lot is I think that they should choose to make the decision because the pros outweigh the cons, or that the cons outweigh the pros. And I read this a lot. It's not an overly good justification because we need to go into more detail. We need to go into have a bit more sophistication about why we're saying that the pros outweigh the cons. So here are some ideas. So you might say which pro con is the most important to the business. So this is, you can see this is a bit more developed than if you say the pros outweigh the cons. Well, here we can say, well, one of the pros or the cons is the most important to the business. I'm going to choose this to be the most important pro because of this reason. And therefore, this is why I've gone for the conclusion. So this is something that can work. You can say that one stakeholder's view holds more power than the others. So maybe you've got a case study with employees and shareholders. And in your conclusion, you go, well, shareholders are the most powerful stakeholders, so therefore we should go with their opinion. And that can be a justification for us for a conclusion. Maybe you look at short-term versus long-term. So maybe the decision is good in the short term, but bad in the long term. So that's your justification. Maybe you look at the objectives of the business. So in the case study, maybe they tell you about the objectives of the business. So maybe one of the objectives is to keep costs as low as possible. So when you make a conclusion, that's something that you could base your conclusion on. You might choose to focus on one key part of the case study. So the links video we talked about earlier. So in the case study, you're going to find these links, the key parts of the case study. You might decide that one of those links is the most important part of the case study, and that's going to be something that you base your conclusion on. And then finally, maybe you suggest an alternative strategy. I wouldn't only do this because obviously that's not a conclusion. But when I show an example in a minute, you might say that my conclusion is this, blah, 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 blah. Here's an alternative solution that would solve the conclusion that I've actually made. Now, which one of these you use is completely determined by what's in the case study. So there's no way of saying that you should always use this or always use that. But it's just some ideas that you can use. So to give you an example, let's go back to that question. I'm going to move my head down here. If you go back to the question earlier, so should the business introduce a new product into their portfolio? Realize there's a typo there. Very good. So earlier we said in conclusion, the business should not introduce a new product into the portfolio. Now, when we justify it, like I said, it depends on what's in the case study. So I am making this up, but it's the sort of thing you might say. So I said this is because according to the case study, the business is struggling with cash flow and launching a new product would require significant financial investment. So if they launch a new product, there's going to be marketing, research and development, etc., etc. And what I've said here, this is one key part of the case study. So in the case study, we're assuming that it says that they're struggling with cash flow. So therefore, I've said that they shouldn't do it because this is the most important part of the case study. So I've used that one there. Next, I've said, whereas the new product might lead to long-term financial success, it might undermine the current financial status. So you can see I've talked about the short-term versus the long-term. Now, usually we say that the long term is where we should be focusing. But in this situation, the cash flow is so bad that they need to focus on short-term survival. And then I've said instead the business could extend the product life cycle of one of their products. So I've suggested an alternative strategy. So this is one way that you could structure your conclusion. Again, it depends on the case study, what you do. Moving on to the final bit, which is limitations of the information provided in the case study. Now, this is, I think, the most difficult part of the whole AO3 essay. This is actually brand new in the new syllabus. And in order to get top mark band for the AO3 essays, you need to do this. So what do we mean by limitations of the case study? Well, I've broken this down into two. I think you could say, what information have you not been provided with that would be useful? The case study can only be a certain number of words, so they can't tell you everything about the business. So what else do we need that can help us make a good decision? Secondly, is the information provided reliable? So can we trust what's in the case study? If the case study says, well, the CEO heard from employees that, then can we trust the employees as a source of information? Are they biased? Are they trying to tell the CEO a certain thing to influence his decision making? So if I come back to the question, so should the business introduce a new product? Well, something that the business, we might not have been told is the following. Maybe we do not know whether the business has conducted market research on the new product. If market research indicated that the new product would be successful, this might change the recommendation. So here I'm assuming that the case study hasn't told us this. That's a limitation because that would be really important information to make our conclusion. So therefore, that's one limitation. I would also start this sentence with one limitation of the case study is that. And the reason you're starting your sentence with one limitation is you're communicating, you know that you need to talk about limitations in your answer. So it's a very effective way of doing it because you're communicating that you know what the rubric says. So if we put that all together now, I need to move my head again. So the first sentence is we explicitly state in conclusion the business should not introduce a new product. We then have three sentences justifying why using one of those suggestions I gave you earlier. And then we've got a limitation down here, but we start with one limitation moving forward. So to conclude, in your conclusions, I would suggest you go through three things. State your conclusions, state why, and then talk about the limitations of the case study. Okay, hope that was useful. I'll see you next time.